In the history of engineering, few figures loom as large or cast as dangerous a shadow as Ferdinand de Lesseps. By 1879, he was not merely a man, he was a monument in a three-piece suit. Known across the continent as Le Grand Français, the Great Frenchman, he possessed a fame that eclipsed kings and presidents. His celebrity was built on a single, monumental achievement: the Suez Canal. When he slit the desert floor to marry the Mediterranean with the Red Sea in 1869, he did more than shorten the trade routes of the world. He seemed to rewrite the laws of nature. But de Lesseps was not an engineer. He was a diplomat, a charmer, and a supreme optimist. He possessed a narcotic confidence that could paralyze the critical faculties of investors and politicians alike. His success at Suez had convinced him of a dangerous fallacy, that faith moves mountains, quite literally. He came to believe that technical difficulties were merely manifestations of pessimism, and that any obstacle, be it geological or political, could be dissolved by willpower alone. He viewed the world through a lens of romantic destiny, where he was the protagonist chosen by history to unite humanity through commerce. This messianic complex was the engine of his rise, but in the steaming jungles of Panama, it would become the engine of a massacre. The success of Suez was the worst thing that could have happened to the Panama Project. Suez was a diplomatic canal. Its primary challenges had been political negotiation and the sheer volume of sand to be moved. Geologically, it was a flat, dry desert. There were no mountains to cross, no volatile rivers to tame, and, crucially, no tropical diseases. It was a project of endurance, not complex engineering. When de Lesseps turned his gaze to the American Isthmus, he superimposed the map of Suez onto the map of Panama. He saw another narrow strip of land separating two oceans and assumed the solution was identical: a sea-level canal, an open cut without locks or dams. He ignored the fundamental differences. Panama was not a flat desert. It was a spine of volcanic rock buried under a suffocating rainforest, crisscrossed by raging rivers. By treating Panama as Suez II, de Lesseps was not just making an engineering error, he was committing a category error. He was trying to dig a ditch in a land that required a bridge. To legitimize his vision, de Lesseps convened the Congrès International d'études du Canal Interocéanique in Paris in May 1879. It was billed as a gathering of the world's greatest scientific minds to objectively determine the best route for a Central American canal. In reality, it was a piece of elaborate theater, a kangaroo court rigged to rubber stamp de Lesseps's predetermined decision. Of the 136 delegates who filled the hall of the Geographical Society, only a fraction were engineers. The rest were politicians, speculators, friends of de Lesseps, and members of the general public caught
up in the fervor. The technical committees were packed with de Lesseps's allies. When serious questions were raised about the cost or the geology, de Lesseps would charm the room with vague promises or dismiss the dissenters as enemies of France. He controlled the agenda, the timing, and the mood. The conclusion was written before the opening gavel fell. A sea-level canal at Panama was the only option worthy of French genius. Yet, there was one man in the room who refused to applaud. Adolphe Gaudin de Lépinay was a seasoned French engineer who had spent years building railroads in the tropical hellscape of Mexico. Unlike the armchair geographers in Paris, he knew the smell of the jungle and the violence of the tropical rains. He understood the biological toll of the tropics on European bodies. Ferdinand de Lesseps stood before the Congress and delivered a warning that was chillingly prescient. He argued that a sea-level canal was impossible due to the volatility of the Chagres River, which would flood the works. He also predicted that the death toll from yellow fever would be catastrophic. Instead, he proposed a lock canal, damming the Chagres to create a massive man-made lake that would lift ships over the mountains. It was the exact design the Americans would eventually use to succeed 30 years later. But de Lesseps would not hear it. A lock canal was seen as a sign of weakness, a compromise. De Lesseps wanted an oceanic Bosphorus, a straight, unimpeded path. When the final vote was called, the result was a triumph of popularity over science. 74 delegates voted for the sea-level canal. Of those, only 19 were engineers, and almost none had ever set foot in Panama. Ferdinand de Lesseps was shouted down, his report buried. As he left the hall, he reportedly muttered a curse that would hang over the enterprise. "You have voted for a massacre. You will not build this canal, but you will build a graveyard." With the mandate of the Congress secured, de Lesseps needed capital, massive amounts of it. The initial budget was estimated at over 1 billion francs, a staggering sum. But the major financial houses of Europe, the Rothschilds and the Crédit Lyonnais, were skeptical. They analyzed the risks and quietly closed their doors. A lesser man might have stopped there. De Lesseps, however, did not need the banks. He had something more powerful: the love of the people. He launched the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interocéanique as a crusade of people's capitalism. He bypassed the financial elite and appealed directly to the French public. He turned the IPO, initial public offering, into a patriotic referendum. Buying a share in the Panama Canal was not just an investment, it was an act of faith in France. It was a way to strike back at the Prussians who had humiliated the nation in the War of 1870. Not with bullets, but with engineering glory. Deceased de Lesseps targeted a specific demographic: the petits gens, the little
people, often affectionately called the bas de laine, wool stockings. These were the peasants, shopkeepers, widows, and rural clergy who distrusted the complex machinations of the Paris bourse, but kept their gold coins hidden in wool socks under their mattresses. They were risk-averse, conservative savers who looked for safety. To them, de Lesseps was not a speculator. He was a grandfather figure, a national hero who had delivered 10% dividends with Suez. If he said Panama was safe, it was safe. The marketing campaign was relentless. Newspapers were filled with glowing editorials, many paid for by the company. Lectures were held in village halls across the provinces. The promise was simple: a guaranteed return on investment, secured by the inevitable march of progress. When the subscription opened in December 1880, it was a stampede. Over 100,000 investors bought in. Families sold their land, liquidated their inheritances, and emptied their savings to buy shares at 500 francs apiece. The company raised 300 million francs in days. It was the most democratic capitalization in history, and it meant that when the collapse finally came, it would not just hurt a few wealthy bankers, it would devastate the spine of French society. Before a single shovel of earth was moved, de Lesseps staged a final, grandiose piece of theater to seal the public's confidence. In January 1880, he sailed to Panama with his young family to inaugurate the work. The gesture was calculated. By bringing his wife and small children into the pest hole of the universe, he was visually demonstrating that the fears of disease were unfounded. He arrived in Cologne during the dry season, the few short months when the rains stopped and the mosquito populations dipped. He toured the isthmus like a visiting monarch, holding banquets and toasting to the health of the colony. He famously dismissed the yellow fever as an invention of jealous rivals. "I have not seen a single mosquito," he declared, ignoring the fact that he was sleeping in the best hotels, far from the swamps where the workers would live. The first dig ceremony was scheduled for New Year's Day, 1880. A boat was chartered to take de Lesseps and a crowd of dignitaries to the mouth of the Rio Grande to turn the first spade of earth. But in a fitting omen for the project, the tide was out. The boat could not reach the shore. Undeterred by reality, de Lesseps simply ordered a champagne crate filled with sand to be brought onto the deck of the ship. There, on the clean wooden deck of a steamship, miles from the jungle mud, his 7-year-old daughter Ferdinand struck the first blow with a ceremonial shovel. The crowd cheered, the champagne flowed, and the press reported that the work had begun. It was a perfect metaphor for the French effort, a symbolic gesture performed in a sanitized environment, completely disconnected from the brutal reality of the earth. De Lesseps declared victory and sailed away to New York to sell more stock, leaving behind a few engineers to face the waking jungle. As his ship disappeared over the horizon, the dry season ended, the rains began, and the eggs in the stagnant water began to hatch. De Lesseps saw Panama as a geometry problem, a simple line to be drawn across a map. But when the French engineers arrived in 1881, they discovered that Panama was not a place. It was a living, hostile entity. The geography itself seemed designed to repel human ambition. The isthmus was a geological chaotic zone, a spine of volcanic rock buried under a suffocating blanket of jungle. It was a place where the rules of European engineering did not apply. The primary antagonist was the Chagres River. In the dry season, it was a deceptively calm stream, winding lazily through the valleys. But the Chagres was a monster in disguise. The French engineers, accustomed to the predictable rivers of Europe like the Seine or the Loire, were unprepared for the violence of the tropical climate. During the rainy season, which lasted for 8 punishing months, the skies would open with biblical fury. The Chagres could rise 30 feet in a single day, transforming from a stream into a raging torrent that swallowed bridges, machinery, and men. Gaudin de Lépinay had warned them about this. He had told them that a sea-level canal would turn the Chagres into a cataract that would flood the works. But de Lesseps, sitting in his office in Paris, had dismissed the river as a minor nuisance. Now, the river was tearing his blueprints apart. Then there was the Culebra Cut. To build a sea-level canal, the French had to slice through the Continental Divide, the ridge of mountains that ran down the spine of the Americas. This meant digging a canyon 9 miles long and hundreds of feet deep. It was the largest excavation ever attempted in human history. The French attacked the mountain with steam shovels and dynamite, but the mountain fought back. The geology of Culebra was unstable, a treacherous layer cake of clay and shale that turned into a lubricant when wet. As soon as the steam shovels dug a hole, the sides would liquefy and slide back in, burying the tracks and the trains. It was like trying to dig a trench in a bowl of soup. The engineers called it the sliding mountain. Every foot of depth was bought with sweat and frustration, and often it was erased overnight by a single rainstorm. While the engineers fought the earth, the doctors fought a phantom. The medical science of the 1880s was firmly rooted in the ancient theory of miasma. The prevailing belief was that disease was caused by bad air, poisonous vapors rising from rotting vegetation and swamp mud. In the humid, rotting jungle of Panama, everything smelled of decay. The air was thick, heavy, and pungent. To the French doctors, this smell was the disease. This belief was tragic because it led them to fight the wrong enemy. They cleared the brush to let the wind blow through.
They burned tar to purify the air. They told workers to avoid the night air, which was considered particularly deadly. They focused entirely on the smell, ignoring the clouds of insects that swarmed around them. The miasma theory was a blindfold that prevented them from seeing the true assassin. They were fighting a war against a smell while the real killer landed softly on their skin, unnoticed. The workforce that arrived to fight this war was a segregated army. At the top were the French engineers and managers, the officials who lived in the Grand Hotel in Cologne, or the purpose-built bungalows in the high ground of Ancon. They brought their European lifestyle with them, their wine, their linens, and their arrogance. They believed their status would protect them. Below them was a vast, expendable army of laborers recruited from the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Martinique, and St. Lucia. These men were promised $1.50 a day, a fortune compared to what they could earn on the sugar plantations at home. They came by the thousands, packed onto steamships that smelled of sweat and hope. They were the muscle of the operation, the men who would wield the picks and shovels in the mud. The French viewed them as machines, units of energy to be consumed and replaced. There was a cold calculus to their employment. It was cheaper to import a new Jamaican than to install a steam shovel. But the ledger of death did not respect this hierarchy. In fact, the white man's grave, as Panama came to be known, was often more lethal to the Europeans. The West Indian workers, having grown up in tropical climates, sometimes had childhood exposure to yellow fever, granting them a degree of immunity. The French, arriving fresh from the temperate climate of Europe, were biological virgins. Their immune systems had never encountered the viral payload of the jungle. They were dry tinder waiting for a spark. The horror began slowly. A young engineer would complain of a headache in the morning. By noon, he would be shivering violently, wrapped in wool blankets despite the sweltering heat. By evening, he would be delirious, shouting about snow in Paris. And then, the silence would come. The company, desperate to maintain morale and keep the stock price high, began to hide the bodies. There were no official announcements. A man would simply not show up for breakfast at the mess hall. His name would be erased from the roster. His belongings, his letters, his watch, his clothes, would be quietly packed into a trunk and shipped back to France on the next boat. The official cause of death listed in the company records was often vague: fever, exhaustion, or sunstroke. The word yellow fever was forbidden. It was a word that could crash the stock market. But in the shanty towns and the officers' clubs, the truth was whispered. The dingy boats, the supply ships that brought meat and flour, were leaving with a different kind of cargo. The green hell was claiming its toll, and the payments were just beginning. The true ruler of Panama was not Ferdinand de Lesseps, nor the French government. It was a creature smaller than a grain of rice, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. To the naked eye, it was just a nuisance, a buzzing speck with white markings on its legs, often called the tiger mosquito. But biologically, it was a perfectly evolved delivery system for death. Unlike the Anopheles mosquito, which carried malaria and preferred the swampy marshes at the edge of town, the Aedes aegypti was a domestic predator. It loved civilization. It thrived in the clean, still water found in man-made containers, flower vases, cisterns, water barrels, and the holy water fonts of churches. It did not fly far, usually staying within a few hundred yards of where it was born. It lived with its victims, breeding in their homes, sleeping under their beds, and dining on their blood. The mosquito was the vector for a flavivirus that attacked the liver and the kidneys with terrifying speed. When a female mosquito bit an infected person, she drew the virus into her gut. After an incubation period, the virus moved to her salivary glands. When she bit her next victim, she injected an anticoagulant to keep the blood flowing, and with it, the virus. It was a biological chain reaction that the French, in their ignorance, were fueling every day. The clinical progression of yellow fever was a nightmare that terrified even the most hardened doctors. It began innocently enough, with symptoms that mimicked a severe flu: high fever, muscle pain, backache, and chills. This was the acute phase. For some, the disease stopped there. But for the unlucky, and in Panama, many were unlucky, the disease entered a second, toxic phase. The virus began to destroy the liver, causing jaundice. The skin and the whites of the eyes turned a deep saffron yellow, the signature mask of the disease. The kidneys failed, and the urine stopped. But the most horrific symptom came from the bleeding. The virus caused massive internal hemorrhaging in the stomach. The blood would coagulate and turn black, mixed with stomach acid. The patient would then begin to vomit this black, tarry substance. This was the vomito negro, the black vomit. It was the herald of death. The end was agonizing. Patients would bleed from the nose, the gums, and even the eyes. They would fall into delirium and coma. In the final hours, the body was essentially liquefying from the inside, and all the while, the mosquitoes buzzed in the room, biting the dying patient, picking up the virus, and preparing to carry it to the next nurse, the next orderly, the next engineer. In a tragic irony, the very institution designed to save lives became the epicenter of the massacre. The French, proud of their civilization, built the L'Hôpital Notre-Dame de Canal at Ancon. It was a beautiful, modern facility, staffed by dedicated French nuns, the Sisters of Charity. It was clean, airy, and well-managed. It was also a death trap. The sisters, obsessed with cleanliness and order, sought to protect their patients from the colony's marching ants, which would crawl up the bed legs to bite the sick. To stop the ants, the nuns placed the legs of every single hospital bed into ceramic bowls filled with water. There were hundreds of beds, hundreds of bowls of still, clean water, placed in cool, shaded wards. It was the perfect artificial hatchery for Aedes aegypti. The mosquitoes laid their eggs in the water right under the sleeping patients. When the larvae hatched, they didn't have to fly far to find a meal. They swarmed up from the floor to bite the yellow fever patients, loading themselves with the virus, and then flew a few feet to bite the incoming patients who had arrived with broken legs or malaria. A man would check into L'Hôpital Notre-Dame with a fractured ankle from a construction accident. A week later, he would leave in a coffin, a victim of yellow fever contracted inside the hospital. The nuns, praying for salvation, were unwittingly tending to the executioners. The mortality rate in the hospital soared to over 75%. It became a place of such dread that workers would hide their illnesses, preferring to die in the mud of their shanties rather than enter the antechamber of the grave. The volume of death overwhelmed the capacity of the rituals. At first, there were military funerals for the officers, with flags and speeches. But soon, the flags were put away. It was bad for morale to see the tricolors constantly at half-mast. The speeches stopped because there was no one left with the energy to give them. A new schedule was added to the Panama Railroad, the funeral train. It ran daily from Cologne to the cemetery at Monkey Hill. It carried stacks of plain wooden coffins. When the wood ran out, they used empty dynamite crates. When the crates ran out, they pickled the bodies in barrels of alcohol to ship them home, or simply buried them in mass graves. The psychological toll on the survivors was absolute. A fatalism settled over the isthmus. Men stopped saving money. They drank their wages in champagne and absinthe every night, toasting to those who were about to die. Prostitution and gambling exploded. If you might be dead by Tuesday, what was the point of virtue? The social contract disintegrated. The only ledger that mattered was the one kept by the Mosquito, and it was demanding payment in blood, every hour, on the hour. The French effort was no longer an engineering project. It was a siege, and the enemy was invisible, invincible, and everywhere. If biology was the silent assassin in Panama, geology was the noisy executioner. By 1884, the French effort had moved from the initial clearing of the jungle to the brutal reality of excavation, and the center of this battle was the Culebra Cut. This was the spine of the isthmus, the continental divide where the mountains rose over 300 feet above sea level. To build de Lesseps's dream of a sea-level canal, a oceanic Bosphorus, this mountain range didn't just need to be crossed, it needed to be erased. The French engineers attacked Culebra with the confidence of men who had conquered the sands of Suez. They brought the finest excavators in Europe, massive steam shovels, bucket dredgers, and miles of Decauville track. But they soon discovered that Culebra was not made of honest rock. It was a treacherous, chaotic layer cake of clay, shale, and volcanic ash. When dry, it was as hard as concrete. When wet, and in Panama it was almost always wet, it turned into a viscous, unstable sludge. The engineers would spend weeks digging a trench, celebrating their progress as the steam shovels groaned and bit into the earth. Then, the rains would come. In the middle of the night, a terrifying rumble would echo through the valley. The workers would rush out to find that the sides of the mountain had liquefied. The trench they had dug was gone, filled back in by a landslide of mud that had swallowed the tracks, the trains, and the shovels. It was a Sisyphean nightmare. The mountain was moving. In some months, the French excavated 500,000 cubic meters of earth, only to find that 400,000 cubic meters of mud had slid back into the cut. They weren't digging a canal. They were bailing out a quicksand pit. The machinery itself was a testament to the hubris of the planning. De Lesseps, refusing to listen to engineers with tropical experience, had ordered equipment suited for the flat, dry terrain of Europe. The French contractors arrived with light, side-discharge excavators that were designed for railway embankments in France. They brought snow shovels to fight mud. The light French locomotives were too weak to haul the heavy, wet spoil up the steep grades of the cut. When the rains came, the tracks, laid on unballasted mud, would sink or slide away, derailing the trains. The bucket dredgers, designed for the soft sand of Suez, broke their teeth on the submerged tree trunks and volcanic rocks of the Chagres River. The industrial might of the 19th century, so dominant in the temperate world, looked pathetic against the sheer biological and geological density of the tropics. Worst of all was the lack of standardization. Because the company was flush with cash from the wool-stocking investors, they threw money at the problem chaotically. They ordered machines from France, Belgium, America, and Britain. The result was a logistical babble. A steam shovel from Belgium would break a piston, but the only spare parts in the warehouse were for a British crane. The jungle became a graveyard of rusting iron, machines that had worked for a month and then been abandoned for want of a screw. As if the rain, the mud, and the mosquitoes were not enough, the earth itself rejected the French presence. On the morning of September 7th, 1882, the ground beneath the isthmus convulsed. A massive
Earthquake struck Panama, cracking the masonry of the cathedral in Panama City and sending a tsunami of panic through the workforce. At the construction sites, the damage was psychological as much as physical. The tracks twisted like spaghetti. The few stable structures the French had built cracked. The earthquake destroyed the illusion of stability. It reminded every man on the isthmus that they were digging on top of a volcanic fault line. The native workers saw it as an omen. The land was angry. The French engineers, men of science, tried to calculate the shear forces, but in their diaries, they recorded a growing sense of dread. How could they build a rigid sea-level canal in a zone that moved? By 1885, the dream of the Strait of Panama was mathematically dead. The engineers on the ground knew it. Ferdinand de Lesseps had known it 5 years earlier. To dig down to sea level at Culebra meant removing a volume of earth that was increasing exponentially with every landslide. The deeper they dug, the more unstable the slopes became, requiring wider and wider cuts. It was a geometry of infinite regress. The only solution, the only engineering possibility, was to abandon the sea level idea and build locks. They needed to dam the Chagres River to create a lake which would tame the floods and reduce the amount of digging required at Culebra. But admitting this meant admitting that de Lesseps was wrong. It meant admitting that the great Frenchman had sold the public a lie. For 2 years, the engineers in Panama sent frantic cables to Paris, begging for permission to switch to a lock system. For 2 years, de Lesseps refused. His ego was the dam that held back reality. He had promised a sea-level canal. A lock canal was a sign of weakness, a second-rate ditch. He fired engineers who disagreed with him. He suppressed reports. He forced the company to continue digging a hole that could never be finished, burning millions of francs on a sea-level fantasy while the jungle laughed. It wasn't until 1887, when the company was bleeding to death, that he finally, grudgingly, hired Gustave Eiffel to design locks. But by then, it was too late. The ledger was already in the red, and the ink was turning to blood. Nunn Paris, the headquarters of the Compagnie Universelle on the Rue Caumartin, was a cathedral of silence. While the steam shovels rusted in the mud of Culebra, the clerks in Paris were busy manufacturing the appearance of success. The financial burn rate was catastrophic. By 1885, the company had spent nearly all of its initial capital, 300 million francs, and had excavated barely 10% of the required earth. The operational costs were spiraling out of control. The cost of coal in the jungle was 4 times the price in Europe. The cost of labor was inflating as workers realized the danger and demanded higher hazard pay. And then there was the health tax, the millions spent on hospitals, coffins, and the constant recruitment of new men to replace the dead. But the most dangerous expenses were not in Panama. They were in Paris. To keep the stock price buoyant, de Lesseps had to maintain the illusion of infinite progress. This required a constant stream of new capital. The company began issuing new bonds, each with higher interest rates than the last, desperate to pay off the interest on the previous loans. It was a classic Ponzi scheme structure, fueled by nationalistic pride. They were borrowing from Peter to pay Paul.
and Peter was a peasant in Lyon who was emptying his life savings. As the reality of the failure became impossible to hide from the insiders, the company turned to crime. They established a secret budget, euphemistically labeled publicity expenses. This was the slush fund. Its purpose was not to buy concrete or steel, but to buy silence. The man in charge of this dark ledger was Baron Jacques de Reinach, a financier of slippery morality who acted as the company's fixer. Reinach understood that in the Third Republic of France, everything and everyone had a price. He set up a system of syndicates and shell companies to funnel cash to anyone who could threaten the canal's image. The first line of defense was the newspapers. The French press was powerful, partisan, and notoriously corrupt. In the 1880s, financial journalism was often little more than a protection racket. Editors would threaten to publish negative reports about a company's solvency unless they were paid for advertising. The Panama Company paid them all. They paid the prestigious Le Figaro to run glowing profiles of de Lesseps. They paid the populist Le Petit Journal to assure the working class that their investments were safe. They created entire fake newspapers whose sole purpose was to print positive updates about the canal excavation. Journalists who visited Panama were given guided tours of the few functional sites, wined and dined in the Grand Hotel, and sent home with heavy envelopes of cash. The few honest reporters who tried to write about the landslides or the yellow fever were smeared as unpatriotic or agents of American jealousy. The French public was living in a media bubble, reading daily reports of triumph while the workers were dying in the mud. But the corruption didn't stop at the printing press. It went to the heart of the government. By 1888, the company needed legislative approval to issue lottery bonds, a desperate financial instrument that would allow them to raise money by appealing to the gambler's instinct of the public. This required an act of parliament. Baron de Reinach went to work on the National Assembly. He walked the halls of the Palais Bourbon with a checkbook in his pocket. He didn't just bribe backbenchers, he bribed ministers. 104 legislators, deputies, and senators were later accused of taking payments. They were nicknamed the checkouts, checkbook members. The payments were disguised in creative ways.
Some were given options on stock that guaranteed a profit. Others were given consulting fees. Some simply accepted bags of banknotes in quiet restaurants. In exchange, these elected officials stood up in the chamber and gave thundering speeches about the glory of France and the genius of de Lesseps. They voted to allow the lottery bonds, knowingly luring their own constituents into a burning building. The government became a co-conspirator in the fraud. They knew the canal was failing. The Minister of Works had seen the confidential reports from the engineers. But the government was terrified of the political fallout if the company collapsed. They chose to prop up the lie rather than face the truth. They became the guarantors of a swindle, selling out the wool stockings to protect the political elite. The sickness ledger now included the soul of the Republic. When the bankruptcy was declared in 1889, the noise in Panama stopped. The steam shovels, once the symbols of French might, were left where they stood. They became known as the ghost train, miles of rusting iron slowly being swallowed by the vines. The jungle reclaimed its territory with terrifying speed. Orchids bloomed in the smokestacks of locomotives. The great trench at Culebra filled with green water and bred new generations of mosquitoes. France retreated, humiliated. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who believed he could bend nature, died in 1894, senile and disgraced, his name synonymous with failure. But the scar remained on the land, a muddy graveyard
that had cost 22,000 lives and erased the savings of 800,000 peasants. It would take another empire to finish the job. In 1904, the United States bought the rusting assets of the French company for $40 million, a fraction of what France had spent. President Theodore Roosevelt saw the canal not just as commerce, but as naval destiny. But the Americans did not just buy the machines, they bought the lesson. They arrived with a new weapon, one that de Lesseps had ignored: biology. Dr. William Gorgas, an army physician who had studied the work of Cuban Dr. Carlos Finley, understood that the mosquito was the enemy. Finley had been arguing for decades that Aedes aegypti was the vector of yellow fever, but he had been ignored by the miasma traditionalists. The Americans listened. Before a single new shovel of earth was turned, Gorgas declared martial law on the mosquito. It was the most expensive public health campaign in history. He didn't just drain the swamps, he fumigated every house in Panama City. He screened the windows of the hospitals. He put oil on the surface of every rain barrel and cistern to suffocate the larvae. He hired brigades of men whose only job was to swat mosquitoes. The French had spent millions on champagne and hospitals that killed. The Americans spent millions on screens and oil. And it worked. By 1906, yellow fever was eradicated from the canal zone. The black vomit vanished. With the biological barrier removed, the American engineers, using the lock system Ferdinand de Lesseps had proposed 20 years earlier, finally cut the continent in half. The Panama Canal opened in 1914, a triumph of American steel and sanitation. But beneath the concrete of the Gatun locks lies the invisible foundation of the French failure. The canal is a monument to the fact that finance and engineering are helpless without biology. The sickness ledger of the 1880s proved that you cannot bribe a virus, you cannot negotiate with a parasite, and you cannot build a civilization on a foundation of denial. The French investors paid for this lesson with their fortunes. The workers paid for it with their lives, and the mosquito, the tiny architect of the disaster, remains the deadliest animal in human history. A reminder that in the war between man and nature, nature always bats last.